Hello, I'm Alex Burton, and this is the Business File. Our program today will focus on one of the major dilemmas of our time, the challenge of productivity. Without doubt, this dilemma is the most important and certainly the most troubling our business community will face in the immediate future. And it's important because its impact transcends the normal boundaries of business. It touches on our national sense of who and what we are. It tampers with our self-respect as a nation and as a people. Today, we'll investigate the dilemma of productivity. We will trace its origins, explore its impact and its dangers, and we'll discuss ways the dilemma might be resolved. We will travel to the West Coast to talk with two men who are meeting the challenge of productivity head on. Before we meet our guests, however, I'd like you to see a short documentary we've prepared on productivity. Once upon a time in America, there was a golden age of productivity. Throughout the world, we were respected for the remarkable efficiency with which we could produce goods and services. It was a curious blending of our values concerning work and the flowering of our inventive spirit, and for 100 years or more, no one on earth could compare. It began, this golden age, toward the end of the 19th century in the laboratory of Thomas Edison. Here, with perhaps as much tenacity and good management as genius, he did what had never been done before. After conducting 6,000 tests, he found a fiber of bamboo that would burn in a vacuum for 1,000 hours. It was the first incandescent lamp. It was the beginning. In the 35 years between the end of the Civil War and the end of the century, the U.S. Patent Office granted more than 500,000 patents. The telephone, the camera, the sewing machine, typewriter, and the new technologies required to manufacture these inventions in great numbers. There were improvements in dynamos and motors, and then a man named Henry Ford improved an idea that Eli Whitney once had and created the first assembly line. America was off and running on all cylinders, and for nearly a century would outwork, out-invent, out-manage, and out-produce the world. But then, one day, not long ago, almost before we were aware of it, the golden age began to tarnish. In comparison to other industrialized nations, our rate of productivity growth began to decline. During the period from 1960 to 1966, of the major industrialized nations, the United States, Canada, Japan, Italy, West Germany, France, and the United Kingdom, only the United Kingdom had a productivity growth rate lower than our own. Then from 1967 to 73, the growth rate of U.S. productivity lagged even further behind. Less than a third of that of Japan, less than half Italy's productivity growth rate. From 1973 to 1979, all industrialized nations, except West Germany, suffered a decline. Our growth rate was still sliding, a decline which continues to this day. Why is American business and industry experiencing this strange and troubling malaise in its productivity capacity? Experts, in their search for the root cause, have found some very definite economic factors which affect productivity. For instance, nearly 11% inflation from 1978 through 1981, fueled by huge federal deficits. Increased tax and regulatory pressures on business, higher interest rates, restrictive union practices, a growing competitive edge among foreign producers, an aging production base in the United States. The average age of a plant and its equipment is 16 and a half years. In Japan, it's only 10 years. In West Germany, 12. So we have a larger proportion of obsolescent facilities and a smaller proportion of the latest productive technology. So where does it lead, this descending stair, this pattern of diminishing possibility? It leads directly, inevitably, to second-class citizenship in a world of nations that have passed us by. The challenge to American business is to halt the decline in the growth rate of productivity. In order to do that, the root causes have to be identified and positive programs have to be put in place to get business back into a leadership position. As I mentioned at the top of the program, our guests today are two gentlemen who know as much about the challenge of productivity as anyone in the country. The first is Robert Waterman, a director of McKinsey & Company in San Francisco and co-author, along with Tom Peters, of the best-selling book In Search of Excellence. Bob, it's a real pleasure to visit with you today, and I'm looking forward to our conversation on productivity.
Well, Alex, it's fun to have you. It's good to be here, and I love to talk about it.
Also joining us is Dr. William Ochi, who is Professor of Management at the Graduate School of Management, UCLA. Professor Ochi, I've been eagerly awaiting our visit.
Thank you, Alex. Pleasure.
Bob, let me ask this first question of you. Now, I am torn between a belief that this dilemma of American productivity is either remarkably simple or terribly complex. On the one hand, it seems like something we should be able to solve with a little logic and cooperative spirit. And then on the other hand, it seems to defy solution. So I wonder if you might cut to the heart of it. First, to make sure that we're all discussing the same topic, could you give us a good working definition of productivity?
I think the fundamental concept is pretty simple, and that is simply getting more output, however you measure it, out of the number of hours worked, either as an individual or an organization or group of people. Easier to measure, of course, when you're talking about productivity in the basic industries, because you can look at a number of tons of coal mined per man shift or something like that. And when you get into white-collar productivity, it's much harder to measure.
I have a feeling that there's something deeper involved here. Dr. Ochi, what is the significance of this loss of productivity?
I think the underlying significance of productivity is that if each of us has the aspiration that we will be better off financially tomorrow than we are today, if we each hope that our children will one day be better off than we are ourselves, the only way that all of us as a nation can achieve that is if we are more productive. That is the only way through which we can increase the size of the economic pie. It is by improving our productivity. For most of the period after World War II, productivity in this country rose in the range of 3 to 5% a year. In the last 5 years, productivity has increased in the United States an average of 0 each year. On the other hand, our major competitors in Europe and Japan have had annual productivity increases in the last 5 years in the range of 5% to 8 or 9%. And what that means, if it keeps up, is that we will be the poorest of the industrial nations one day.
If productivity growth is so important to us as a nation and as a people, I can only ask what happened. Here we were, probably the most productive nation on earth, and suddenly the economic pie is being nibbled away. Bob, can you identify the factors that have led to the decline in our productivity growth?
Well, they're not the ones most people think about. I mean, most people would attribute it to the unions or to not enough investment in technology or not enough capital investment. Our feeling is that some of those things may be contributing factors, but the main problem is management attitude.
Management attitude? What do you think, Professor Ochi?
I think primarily the reason is that we got to feeling that we were in control. We got to feeling that we had the best way of doing things, didn't have to think about improving. At the end of World War II, for example, anybody who wanted to buy a ship, an airplane, an oscilloscope, or a ton of steel had to buy it in America. The industrial plant of Europe and of Japan had been destroyed during the war, and while they rebuilt, we supplied their needs and did so without competition. We got accustomed to operating as though we were a monopolist in the world markets, but today we no longer are and probably never will be again.
That's intriguing, because I really wouldn't have expected you two to say that. But if this problem is management's to solve, what changes must management make to have their organizations more productive?
Alex, that's a good question. It's a complicated question. at some level, but I'll try to simplify it. Again, getting back to the management attitude theme, I think first of all, you have to convince managers at lots of levels, top management, but also middle management, first line supervision, that everybody has something to contribute to the productivity gain, and you have to listen to them. And we're all in it together, so that you've got, you don't have we-they splits inside companies. And so I think lots of training, seminars, those kinds of things that deal with attitudes are terribly important. I think another thing you can do is take layers out of organizations. We've tended, I think, to get over-layered and over-bureaucratized. It's a form of incentive. I mean, you get promoted, you get more money, and so we develop organization structures that over time just have too many layers and too many reporting relationships. Because what was originally a good idea has gotten kind of messed up with the compensation system. And it really doesn't take that many layers to run most big companies, we don't think. So you take layers out so that you have a lot more direct communication between the top and the bottom of organizations. Then certainly you have to worry about the technologies. I mean, the new technologies coming along will contribute to productivity if they're accepted by the people using them. You've got to worry about capital investment, R&D expenditure, and things like that, and make sure you've got those things right. But I think the major changes have to be, just to summarize, to work on attitudes, to change old beliefs about the way you control organizations, to take layers and other forms of what I consider just unnecessary bureaucracy out. I think organizations bureaucratic systems and organizations, I think, tend to grow up like weeds in a garden. And you just you got to keep working at it to keep that stuff out. It gets in everybody's way. Nobody wants it. But if you're not watching it, you come back 1 year later and there it is again. And you have to get that stuff out of people's way so they can get the job done. Those are the main things.
In other words, if it was attitude that got us into this dilemma, it will be a change in attitude that will get us out. Professor Ochi, what do you think it'll take?
Well, I think within the company and without the company, there are important changes without which we won't improve productivity. Within the company, what we need to understand is that in every company, it's necessarily true that each worker, each salesperson, clerk, and manager, no matter how humble their job, knows something special about how to do that job best, which no one else knows. The result is that a company can be productive only by granting the freedom and the discretion to each worker to make their own decisions about how to do their work. The catch is you can't grant that much freedom and discretion to somebody if you don't trust them. The first step, therefore, is you must do those things that build an atmosphere of trust between the managers, between the marketing, finance, and manufacturing departments, between superiors and subordinates.
How do you build that kind of atmosphere?
I think the most important way that you build an atmosphere of trust is to understand that the leader has to be a person who is transparent. That is to say, if your subordinates worry that you are concealing some motives, if they worry that you are concealing your true intentions, they cannot trust you. Now, the way you make yourself transparent, you can't obviously have them physically see through you. The way to create that effect is to be completely consistent. That is, to treat your subordinates the same way you treat your colleagues, the same way you treat your boss, the same way you treat your spouse, your children, your father and mother. If you are consistent and integrated in the way you approach everyone with whom you deal, you give yourself the quality of transparency. People who feel you are transparent won't worry that you're concealing an agenda from them, and they'll trust you.
Well, certainly we all agree that it is imperative to establish this kind of trust in the business environment. And what I hear you say is that trust is a given. Now I need to know, where does the push for productivity start? Bob?
Well, I think productivity in any major sense for a whole corporation has to start with the top. The top has to let the organization know that's a priority. And I think the top of the organization has to support the program and be listening.
All right, let's say that commitment for increased productivity is made at the top. Then how can this concept grow and expand and become important to the entire organization?
Well, as corny as it sounds, Alex, and as many times as people have said it, I think the word for it is communication. What astonished us about the companies we labeled excellent is the sheer volume of communication that's going on. And it's not the kind you think of. You normally think about communication in an organization as going up and down through channels. What we found is as you look inside some of these companies, what we found is an environment that almost looks chaotic. People running around, open offices, shirt sleeves environments in some cases. Delta Airlines having a policy, or being proud of the fact that they changed the rugs in their executive suite so often because the mechanics are in there talking to the president, things like that. So lots and lots of communication. Well, if you've got lots and lots of communication, people asking those questions, people not being afraid to talk to the president or talk up and down the line, the president not being embarrassed about wandering around. There's a wonderful phrase we picked up at Hewlett-Packard, MBWA, little signs and buttons and posters. And what it stands for is management by wandering around. And they're quite serious about it. We thought they were just kidding. Turns out to be a very common characteristic. Not always labeled the same thing, but a common characteristic of the well-managed companies is that top officers and the middle managers are out of the ivory tower, out from behind closed doors, talking to the folks. And it's as simple as that.
So now the whole organization is aware there will be a push for productivity. But it seems to me, when that push comes to shove, it's the first line manager, the one who manages the workers directly, who's got to make it happen. Professor Ochi, how do you make sure that that person accepts the company's productivity priority as his or her own?
Well, in the end, I think the critical person in a large company is the first line manager, the supervisor. And what I see very often is that the top management will say, it's time for change, and what we're going to do is implement quality control circles for our workers. The last ones to hear about it, unfortunately, are the first-level supervisors who don't understand, who themselves are not being treated by their bosses in an open and participative way. And the result is that the attempt to implement a change at the workforce level fails. I think it's absolutely critical that the middle management involve the first-level supervisors in a discussion about what their goals should be, how they ought to get there, and be prepared for the fact that the first-level supervisors who know a lot are going to tell the middle managers how to do it.
All right, let's assume the first-level supervisor buys the program. Now, what specific actions can he take to make an increase in productivity happen?
The first specific action that has to be taken by an operating manager is to remember that, in fact, you can only influence the behavior of one person in the world, and that is yourself. Fortunately, that's enough. If you can begin by treating your subordinates with respect, if you can begin by treating them with openness, if you can be responsive and create a real opportunity for them to tell you what they think, what you're doing that's right and wrong, what they think you as a group ought to be doing, if you can listen to them, make use of their full talents and information by sitting down, having a conversation, and saying, I want to hear your ideas, you will have taken a big first step.
Professor Ochi, Bob, let me stop you here for a moment. Now, I'm hearing words like trust, openness, respect, transparency, and I know these are terribly important to set the tone for productivity, to create a philosophy and an approach for a company. And I understand that they are essential to have a productive environment. But what I need to know now is what tangible actions need to be taken after this environment is developed. Bob, can you help me here?
Well, I'm a big believer in Hawthorne effects. Remember the Hawthorne experiments at Western Electric, where they way back in the 30s, they were playing around with work conditions and productivity. So they'd turn the lights up and productivity would go up. And they'd turn the lights down and productivity would go up again. And they concluded it wasn't work conditions per se, it's the fact that someone's paying attention. And I think in almost every significant change I see in organizations, one of the absolute fundamentals is it's got the attention of the organization. It's on the organization's agenda. Top management is spending time. It's a wonderful phrase. I think it's from Emerson, but I'm not sure. It goes, what you do is so loud I can't hear what you say. So I think to answer your question more specifically, Alex, the first thing you can do is get you, the supervisor, you, the first line manager, to block out time to spend on the issue, even when you're not quite sure what you're going to do. Second is to use part of that time to, in fact, wander about, to get out and get to know your people, ask them questions in a sort of unstructured way, let them talk, listen to them, things like that. Maybe form a few quality circle type groups or suggestion system things. Take them seriously. I mean, the next thing that has to happen is it has to be taken seriously. A slight digression, but a good example. I was asking one of the people from one of the top performing companies what was different about their people and productivity program. And so she told me about some things I already knew about. And then she told me about a suggestion system. And I said, well, lots of people have those. What's different about yours? And she had worked somewhere else, so she could make the comparison. And she said, well, it's simple. She said, this company, management always responds. I submit an idea, I hear back. And where I worked before, I'd submit ideas once in a while, but I'd never hear back, so I assumed it wasn't being taken seriously. I lost all my incentive to do it. Fairly, I mean, the things in some sense are so fundamental that they almost seem naive, or they seem like issues of common courtesy, which they are. At another level, in large organizations, we forget the basics and don't do that. I mean, if you get sophisticated when you're not doing the basics right, the whole thing doesn't work.
Very revealing, Bob. It leads me to one further question, Professor Ochi. We've talked about what can be and should be done, but I wonder if you might outline what actually has been done by companies that have improved their productivity.
The companies that have really good records at productivity are the companies that have understood that in order to improve productivity, they must rely on the ideas of their technicians, their professional people, their lower-level managers, the people who are close to the job, who understand the problems. And then they've done two things. Number one, they've provided those people with a great deal of technical training, so they understand how to set up a productivity problem, how to study it, how to analyze it, and seek solutions. And number two, they have put into place a very participative and open flow of communication so that those good ideas won't be frustrated, but rather can bubble up and action can be taken.
It would seem to me this is a long-range proposition, am I right?
My estimate is that if a company decides that it's going to get very serious about instituting improvements in productivity, it's going to be about 2 years before they will see a noticeable difference, about 5 years before they'll begin to feel that they are probably there, and about 20 years before they can relax, if ever.
Well, gentlemen, it's been a fascinating conversation. I only wish we had more time. Bob, thank you so much.
Well, great, Alex. It's been fun to talk. As you can tell, I love to talk about it. But I think it's terribly important stuff. And we've been too long getting around to recognizing it. So thank you very much.
Professor Ochi, thank you so much for meeting with us. I think the insights you shared will be of tremendous help. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure.
The challenge of productivity. Well, I will confess it's not exactly what I thought it was when I began to research this program. When I began to look for answers, I thought the answers to the challenge of productivity would be found in technology, in a more effective coalition between labor and management, in more enlightened government policies, on an economy less restrictive to free enterprise. I looked for answers in the worlds of technology, politics, and economics. But the conditions I saw there were symptoms of the malaise, not the cause, and certainly not the cure. The root cause, as Bob Waterman and Professor Ochi have pointed out, is squarely in the lap of management. The world has changed radically in the last 2 decades, but in the main, management's attitudes towards productivity have not changed enough. We are, by and large, still managing people with the old approaches, which worked for us in the past, but just won't get the job done in the future. And if we are to free ourselves from these old attitudes, we must move to more participative management systems where the individual employees are involved in the decision-making process and have a sense of ownership in what is produced. Management systems which encourage communication and individual growth and complete utilization of each person's talents and intelligence. All this is imperative. It is also possible. Until next time, this is Alex Burton, and this has been The Business File.
The preceding program is part of a college credit course.